Hello, welcome to Deja Vu, the classic TV rewatch channel. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up. Also, hit subscribe and the bell notification button to see more content. The New Housekeeper is the first episode of The Andy Griffith Show. It's directed by Sheldon Leonard, written by Jack Ellenson and Charles Stewart, and it aired October 3rd, 1960. This episode we see is really going to be all about Opie and his adjustments to changes happening in his life. In our opening scene, we see Housekeeper Rose is marrying Wilbur Pine. And Andy starts off by stating, "If anybody here knows why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace." Opie speaks up immediately, interrupting the whole ceremony, throwing a bit of a fit. And he states that Rose was the best housekeeper that they ever had. Now Rose, she offers to stay until Aunt Bee arrives. But Andy declines and says he can't send Wilbur on his honeymoon by himself. That'd be like putting a pig in a sty and taking away the mud. So Opie continues to interrupt with protests, and Andy tells him again and again to be quiet. Finally, he nods to Barney, and Barney reaches over and holds Opie's mouth shut. The ceremony is completed, and they begin to throw rice at the newlyweds. Andy narrowly stops Opie from throwing the whole box of rice and coaches him to do it nicely. Opie's acting in this scene comes off very well for his age, much better than what I think he did in the pilot. He has a lot of lines, and he has a lot of back and forth with everybody except for Wilbur. And he mentions that Rose was the best housekeeper that they ever had. Kind of makes you wonder, because we never really hear, but how many housekeepers did they have before Rose? So Opie gets away with what I think is a lot more here than he ever did in the other episodes. And Andy, in just these first few minutes, seems to be much more personable, in my opinion, than he was in the pilot. Next, we find Opie and Andy standing outside and talking. Opie asks if Rose called. Andy and Opie have a conversation about Rose leaving and Aunt Bee coming over, and Andy really tries to convince Opie that Aunt Bee's going to raise him as good as she raised Andy. Opie walks away afterwards, adding that he won't love her. Now up walks Barney, and he stands at attention and salutes Andy and says he's here to deliver a message. Now Andy kind of replies to him, "Hey, you can calm down, this isn't the army." Barney stresses how much he just really wants to do a good job, and he wants to show the town how qualified he was among all the pool of applicants for this position. And at the end of that, he just adds, and I'd like to thank you, Cousin Andy. Barney adds also that he would like to be known as Reliable Barney Fife. Now, Barney almost leaves without giving his message, but Andy reminds him and he lets him know, hey, Aunt Bee is coming tomorrow. Once again, Opie has a lot of lines, and he has a lot of close-up shots right here as he's talking with Andy. It shows that he seemed to have at least a very good comfort level with the camera, and also a good rapport with Andy, even though the show had just started. So far in this episode, Opie really does come off as a bit of a brat with the things that he says and does, and seems to be defying Andy quite a bit. Like I said, it doesn't seem like he gets away with that quite as much in the later episodes. So Barney comes off as intense already. Not to the level that we see him at later, but you could see that they didn't quite have the character established yet, but they had a good ground to base it off of. The next scene opens with Opie in the kitchen preparing breakfast by himself. Andy walks in, and Opie brags to Andy about the efforts that he made to make the breakfast without Andy or Aunt Bee there. Andy learns that Opie has made 45-minute eggs. Now Opie states, "We don't need Aunt Bee. Tell her to turn around and go right back to where she came from." Again, this almost kind of seems like Opie now has a little bit of a mean streak in this episode. Andy defends Aunt Bee, and there's a knock on the front door. They go to the next room, and Aunt Bee walks in with a huge smile on her face. Aunt Bee and Andy exchange greetings, and then she greets Opie. He looks reluctant, but he gives her a kiss, and immediately he turns around and wipes his mouth. Now, right here is where Opie continues to face away from Andy and Aunt Bee. And while doing that, he asks if he can take a bath, basically just trying to be excused from the situation. Aunt Bee thanks Andy for an opportunity to raise another young'un. So once again, there in the kitchen scene, we had Opie and Andy with a good dialogue between one another, And while sometimes they have a little bit of maybe a cheesiness in some of the lines, you still get the vibe that this really could be a father and son talking to each other. Now it's funny to hear that eventually Frances Bavier and Andy didn't get along, because if they didn't at this point, which I don't know if they did or not, they really do come off as professional in their scenes. Frances Bavier here really shows, to me at least, a good grasp on the acting of her character, because she really does come off as kind of awkwardly meeting Opie, but rejoices really well in seeing Andy, and also kind of goes back to a comfort level of him as the caregiver position that raised him. But she, like I said, does play very well in the sincerity of being thankful for Andy giving her a new purpose, because it seems that wherever she was living before, she was just going through the motions and didn't really have something to wake up for. She seems to really enjoy raising children. So in the fourth scene, we see Andy, Opie, and Aunt Bee at the dinner table. Now, Opie is hardly eating, which apparently is way out of character for him per Andy. And Opie states that he basically is not eating because Rose made this same type of meal differently. Now, Andy is disappointed as Aunt Bee heads to the kitchen, and he tells Opie to go to his room if he's not hungry. So Opie leaves, but not before snagging a plate full of extra chicken. Now we cut away to Opie's room, and we see him devouring the food, and Andy walks in and catches him in the act. So Opie is quick to blame this chicken on his bird Dickie. He says that his bird was hungry and decided to eat the chicken, and that he quote-unquote loves it. Later in the room, Opie is praying before bed. So Aunt Bee is standing by the door listening, and she thinks he's about to add her to his prayers, but instead he adds Rose. Aunt Bee seems a little disappointed there. Now we go to the courthouse, and we see reliable Barney Fife. He is dragging in an arrestee, the first arrestee that we see him do this to. And who is it? It's Emma Brand for the crime of jaywalking. Luckily for Emma, as she is about to be fingerprinted, Andy walks in and he sets her free. Barney is disappointed and afraid that this will start a crime wave. He fears that Mayberry is going to turn into a sin town. Now he stomps off, not for the last time in this series. So this scene, anything with Emma is great. Her facial expressions as she's trying to get a word in edgewise with Barney are just fantastic. She really steals the scene, in my opinion. And then she caps it at the end as she walks out the door yelling at him, calling him a naughty deputy. So later that day, back in Opie's room, Opie declines an offer from Andy to go fishing, and instead he asks him if he can run away from home. Andy schools Opie on the proper etiquette for running away. Opie changes his mind. After all, he doesn't want to leave his paw. But the conversation returns back to Opie really needing to give a chance to Aunt Bee. Now, anybody who's seen the Andy Griffith show probably already knows, but right here is really shown that Andy and Opie really have good father-son moments. And the comedic timing of the writers really keeps the scenes light while not allowing the emotion to escape. And you really kind of see it here when Andy and Opie have that heart-to-heart. So next, Aunt Bee and Andy are in the backyard learning baseball, which apparently she does not excel at. At one point, she's actually holding the bat upside down. So when that doesn't work, they go to the pond, Andy, Opie, and Aunt Bee. Andy's trying to find things that Opie and Aunt Bee can bond about. Andy at this point is playing up Aunt Bee's expertise in fishing, but he's kind of thwarted when Aunt Bee catches a fish and she loses it and runs away screaming. At the end of this day, all three of them end up back in Opie's room again, which seems to be a common point in this episode. And we discover that Aunt Bee accidentally left Opie's birdcage open. Opie accuses her of doing it on purpose, and Aunt Bee leaves the room clearly distraught. In all honesty, to me, Opie really came off as a brat in that scene. So the next morning, Opie is pretending to sleep, and Aunt Bee comes into his room and gives him a kiss goodbye. She's leaving. This is not working, and she's done. So Opie jumps up and he watches from his window as Aunt Bee and Andy are talking outside. Aunt Bee steps into Andy's truck, and suddenly Opie is screaming and running down to them. And he tells Aunt Bee, "I don't want you to go. I want you to stay." Opie explains to Andy He says if she goes, what is going to happen to her? She doesn't know how to do anything, and she's going to be helpless. Opie embraces her, and he tells her, "You need me." This is not the end of the show, but it really is the end of the story arc for Opie in this episode, because we see how much he really needed Aunt Bee, and hopefully sees that he was incorrect in how he was treating her. But according to his dialogue, he really just got to the point, without knowing it, that he cared about her, that he cared about what she was coming into their life to do. So it took her leaving for him to see that he really needed her in his life. Now, the last scene of the episode, Andy and Aunt Bee are on the porch, and Andy is playing the Crawdad song. Opie runs up happy. He says his bird, Dickie, has come back. Andy and Opie finish the song together, while Aunt Bee nods along. And part of the appeal of this show for a lot of people, including me, was the music. Everything has a catchy bluegrass feel to it, and it just is fun to listen to. For the cast of this episode, we have series regulars Andy Griffith, Don Knotts, Ronnie Howard, and Frances Bavier. Also appearing in this episode, Mary Treen as Rose, Frank Ferguson as Wilbur Pine, and Cheerio Meredith as Emma Brand, who you'll later know as Emma Watson. Things of interest. Barney talks as if he was recently hired, but you'll notice in later episodes and later seasons that his tenure seems to change. This is the first and the last time that we see Andy's pickup, and it's the same thing with his yard and actually with his garage door. This episode starts the tradition that every season, at least with the early seasons, starts with an Opie-centered episode, such as The New Housekeeper, which was this one. Then we have Opie the Bully, Mr. McBeevy, Opie the Birdman, Opie Loves Helen, Opie's Job, Opie's Girlfriend, and Opie's First Love. Barney is the first person in this show to present an instrument. If you notice in the first scene, he almost plays the harmonica for the wedding. The first song Andy plays for the series is the Crawdad song, and this is the song that is sung the most in the series at 3 times. This is the only episode where we will see Andy, Aunt Bee, and Opie fishing together. This is also the only time that we will see Wilbur and Rose on the show, even though Rose said she would come back. Now, Andy's superpowers are on display in this episode. It might be hard to catch, but when you go back and look at the kitchen scene, he easily handles eggs that have been cooking for 45 minutes without so much as a scald. The characters of Andy and Opie are the only holdovers from the pilot episode. Frances Bavier was in that pilot episode, but she played a different character. Wilbur Pine, who was played by Frank Ferguson, he should look familiar to you because he comes back later as Mr. Foley the Butcher. Now, you will notice, if you watch the show a lot, that Andy has more of an exaggerated southern accent here, and it does seem to lessen as the series progresses. I couldn't verify this, but according to some sources, the show's creator, Sheldon Leonard, was so admired by The Big Bang Theory, a 2007 show, by its writers, that they named 2 characters, Sheldon and Leonard. And let's talk about the Frances Bavier picture. So there is on the wall of the kitchen, and later in other spots in the show, a picture that is rumored to be Frances Bavier as a young woman. If you look on Google, you will see this as an internet rumor. But according to other sources, this has been verified as false. And this is actually a print of an 18th century picture called Child with an Apple. This episode leaves us with the wisdom that change is hard no matter a person's age, but if we embrace it instead of fighting against it, we can gain new people in our lives that we value and love, and new experiences that make us better people. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of The Andy Griffith Show with me. Thanks for stopping by. This has been Deja Vu, the classic TV rewatch channel. Hope to see you again soon.